Have you ever woken up and wondered, when did the spark leave? Not all at once, of course. It slips away slowly. Maybe in the way you stop looking forward to breakfast. Or how silence becomes so familiar it no longer feels lonely, it just feels normal. There comes a point in life, often after a certain age, when the world grows quiet around you, and you begin to wonder if it's too late to feel alive again. But what if that silence wasn't an ending? What if it was just the space where something new was waiting to begin? This is not a story about youth. It is a story about rediscovery. About waking up one day and realizing that even after decades of repetition, routine, and resignation, something in you still wants more. More energy, more meaning, more life. And that's where Paulo's story begins. At 72 years old, Paulo did not expect much to change. He had stopped asking for joy a long time ago. Life, to him, had settled into something fixed. Quiet mornings, long afternoons, and evenings that dissolved into the static of the television screen. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dramatic. He was just done. Done trying, done hoping, done believing that anything new could still come his way. But life has a strange way of nudging us when we least expect it. Sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected voice, one moment that pierces the quiet, one person who says something simple but true. That moment came for Paulo during an ordinary afternoon. He was walking through the park, his steps slow, heavy, almost reluctant. The trees stood silent, the world unbothered. Until she appeared. Clara, a stranger with a stride full of lightness and a smile that carried warmth, like sunlight through a window. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't even know he needed fixing. She just looked at him, really looked, and said something he hadn't heard in a long time. You know, I truly believe it's never too late to start again. And just like that, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for Paulo to pause. Enough for him to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was right. What followed was not a miracle. It wasn't a perfect transformation overnight. It was something much better. It was real, and it started with the smallest of changes. Let me tell you how Paulo, a man who thought his story had already ended, turned a single sentence into a new beginning. Shall we begin? Paulo hadn't always felt invisible. There was a time when he moved with energy, laughed without hesitation, and believed in plans that stretched far into the future. But that time had faded so gradually, he didn't even notice it slipping away. It happened in the spaces between goodbyes. When his children moved out, when his wife passed, when friends stopped calling, when familiar routines became safety nets he clung to, not out of love, but out of habit. Each morning began the same way. A thick mug of coffee, always black. A slice of white bread buttered on one side. The same chair, by the window. The same silence. He would sit for hours, sometimes pretending to read, sometimes letting the television fill the room with noise he didn't really hear. The days rolled on in quiet repetition, each one blending into the next. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't really living either. And the longer he stayed in that stillness, the more he started to believe the story his mind kept telling him. This is just how it is now. This is what growing old looks like. The body slows down. The joy fades. The purpose disappears. That voice, the one that used to dream, used to reach, used to say yes, had gone quiet, replaced by aches in the joints and a fatigue that settled deep in the bones. Even getting dressed felt like more effort than it was worth. And the worst part wasn't the physical heaviness. It was the quiet agreement he had made with himself that maybe this was all that was left. He told himself it was natural, normal, that other people his age were likely doing the same, slowing down, retreating, learning to expect less from life. And yet, something deep inside never stopped longing. It didn't scream. It didn't beg. It simply whispered, softly, persistently, "There must be more than this." But Paulo ignored that whisper for years. Fully familiar, he kept walking the same paths, eating the same meals, watching the same shows, and each time the whisper rose up, he drowned it out with excuses. "It's too late now. I'm too tired. I wouldn't even know where to start." But the truth, the one he hadn't dared speak, was that he was scared. Not of aging, but of changing. Because what if he tried, and it didn't work? What if he reached, and nothing reached back? It was safer to stay where he was, safer to believe the story that said nothing new was coming. Until a simple sentence cracked the walls he had spent years building. It's never too late to start again. He didn't believe her right away, but he also didn't forget. And sometimes that's all it takes. Not certainty, just a pause, a breath, a moment where you wonder if maybe, just maybe, the story you've been telling yourself isn't the only one you could live. That night, as Paulo sat in his usual chair, staring at the same old screen, her words returned to him. Not with pressure, but with possibility. What if she was right? What if one small change could begin to shift everything? He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in a long time, he had a question. And that was enough to begin. The next morning, Paulo stood in his kitchen staring at the loaf of white bread. It sat there, just as it had every morning for years, waiting to be sliced, buttered, and eaten without thought. But today, he hesitated. Clara's voice still echoed somewhere in his chest. "Start small," she had said. So he did. Instead of reaching for the bread, Paulo opened the pantry and found an old container of oats he had once bought on a whim and forgotten. He poured a small amount into a pot, added water, and let it simmer. He didn't know what he was doing. The smell was unfamiliar. The texture looked strange. Still, he sliced a banana, added a few almonds, and sat down with his bowl. It wasn't extraordinary, but it was different, and that difference was enough to make him feel awake. Not just physically, but emotionally. Something about the warmth of that bowl, the weight of the spoon in his hand, the quiet act of choosing something new, it stirred something. For the first time in years, his breakfast felt intentional. That morning, he didn't slouch as deeply in his chair. He noticed the way the light came through the curtains. He even cracked the window to let a bit of fresh air in. It was a small shift. But small things, when repeated, become patterns. And Paulo began to sense that maybe this was how change actually started. Not with firework, but with a different breakfast. A few days later, her voice, as always, carried energy like morning sun. "How did it go?" she asked. He told her. Not proudly, not like a man who had conquered something, but like someone who had taken one quiet step and found solid ground. "That's beautiful," she said. "Next, let's try something for your body, something small. Stretching," she called it. Not exercise, not a workout. Just a few movements to say good morning to your muscles. At first, it felt ridiculous. Paulo had never been the type to bend or twist or follow anything that resembled a fitness routine. But Clara had promised it would feel different, more like a conversation with his own body. So, he tried. A slow roll of the shoulders, a gentle turn of the neck, a careful reach toward the ceiling. The first few mornings, his body resisted. The stiffness in his joints protested, but after a week, something began to shift. The aches didn't vanish, but they no longer ruled his mornings. He felt lighter, just a little, more mobile, more present. He noticed the sound of birds outside his window, the texture of the rug beneath his feet, the way his breath deepened after each movement. He started to look forward to those early minutes. They weren't long. They weren't intense, but they were his. And for a man who had spent years moving through life on autopilot, those minutes were revolutionary. Something inside Paulo began to wake up. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. This part of the journey was still too new, too tender. But each time he stirred his oatmeal, each time he reached for the sky in the soft light of morning, each time he stepped out of the habits that once defined him, he felt it, the change, a return to himself, to the part of him that still believed life had something to offer. And as that part grew stronger, so did the quiet hope that maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the start of a new chapter. Weeks passed, and the small shift began to ripple through Paulo's life in unexpected ways. His energy, once sluggish and heavy, started to stir gently beneath the surface. He no longer needed an afternoon nap just to get through the day. He found himself walking a little farther when running errands, lingering longer in the sunlight, pausing to watch the birds in the trees. The television stayed off more often now, not because he made a rule, but because something more interesting had taken its place. Living. There was no dramatic moment, no fireworks or overnight transformation, just a quiet unfolding. Every small decision, what to eat, how to move, when to pause, was like lighting a single candle in a dimly lit room. And little by little, the darkness lifted. Clara, true to her nature, remained a gentle guide, not pushing, not fixing, simply walking alongside him with the kind of presence that reminded Paulo what companionship could feel like when it came without pressure. One morning, over coffee on a bench near the park, she asked him a question that caught him by surprise. Do you ever walk just to walk? Not to get somewhere, not because you have to, just to feel your body move? Paulo laughed softly, shaking his head. I used to think walking was only useful if it had a destination. Clara smiled. Maybe the destination is presence. That word stayed with him. Presence. He had spent so many years moving through life, but not really being in it. That afternoon, Paulo laced up his shoes and went for a walk, not to the store, not to the bank, not to check off a task, just to walk. At first it felt aimless, but then something shifted. He began to notice things. The breeze brushing past his cheeks, the warmth of the sun resting on his back, the way his feet made contact with the earth, steady and reliable. He walked slowly. He breathed deeply. He looked around, noticing, not rushing. It was, he realized, the most alive he had felt in a long time. From that day forward, his walks became sacred. They weren't just physical activity. They were moments of communion with the world, with himself, and with the version of him that he had almost forgotten. One who loved to explore. One who felt curious. One who, despite the years that had passed, still had something inside that wanted to reach. It was during one of those walks that he caught his reflection in a shop window. Not just the lines on his face or the silver in his hair, but the posture. It was straighter. The eyes. They held light. The expression. Not tired but awake. Paulo paused and stared for a moment, surprised. He looked like someone he hadn't seen in a while. So, not the man who gave up, but the man who was learning to live again. And as he stood there, watching his reflection move gently with the rhythm of his breath, a quiet smile formed on his lips. Not because everything had changed, but because something had. He was no longer watching life from the sidelines. He was step by step, breath by breath, becoming. One morning, While Paulo was doing his usual stretch by the park bench, an older gentleman approached him slowly. He had seen Paulo there before, always moving with intention, always carrying a quiet focus that seemed to gently push back against the weight of age. "I've been watching you," the man said, offering a sheepish smile. "You look lighter somehow." Paulo blinked, a little startled. He hadn't thought anyone was paying attention. "Lighter?" he asked, unsure whether to laugh. The man nodded. "Like you know something the rest of us forgot." Paulo didn't have a clever answer. He simply smiled and said, "I just started showing up for myself." Those words hung in the air between them. Later that day, he repeated them to Clara. She looked at him with pride. "You see," she said, "you've already begun to pass it on." Paulo didn't intend to become anyone's example, but without realizing it, he was. Neighbors noticed the change in his steps. The barista at the cafe noticed how he stood taller, spoke warmer. His nephew, a young man often weighed down by stress and sleepless nights, once asked, "Uncle Paulo, what are you doing differently?" Paulo smiled, stirred his tea, and answered simply, "I'm giving myself the care I used to save for everyone else." From that moment, the idea began to grow. Maybe others needed to hear this too. Not in a lecture, not in a grand performance, but through shared walks, simple meals, honest conversations. Clara suggested they host a weekly walk in the park. Just a few people, nothing complicated. The first Sunday, it was just Paulo, Clara, and 2 others. The next week, there were 7. A month later, over 20 people gathered, tying shoelaces, sharing stories, and walking together, not in haste, but in harmony. They called it Steps of Renewal, and that's exactly what it became. A place where small changes were celebrated, where no one was too old to begin again, where silence was replaced with laughter, and routine gave way to rhythm. Paulo didn't stand at the front. He walked among them, sharing small tips, nodding encouragement, listening. He never once said, "Follow me." He didn't need to. His story spoke louder than words ever could. One woman, who had quietly joined the group after hearing about it from a friend, walked beside Paulo one morning and said, "I thought I was done too, until I saw you." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. That was when he realized this journey wasn't just about healing his own life. It was about holding open the door for others to step through. Not as a leader or Micah, but as a reminder that change is contagious when it comes from the heart. That when one person dares to live fully, it gives others permission to believe they can too. Paulo had become the kind of man he never expected to be, a quiet force of renewal. And every time he tied his walking shoes, stirred his oatmeal, or reached up to stretch in the morning light, he wasn't just moving his body, he was moving his story forward, one step at a time. It was a Sunday afternoon when Paulo noticed something he hadn't seen before. As the walking group made its way along the winding park trail, chatting in pairs and pausing to admire blooming flowers, he realized they had stopped asking him for advice. They were now sharing it with one another. A retired nurse helped someone adjust their posture. A grandmother shared her favorite low-sugar cookie recipe. A younger man, struggling with anxiety, told the group how these Sunday walks had become his calmest hour of the week. Paulo stood back for a moment, letting it all unfold. And that's when it hit him. What he and Clara had started was becoming a community. Not one built on big promises or dramatic speeches, but on presence, on consistency, and the quiet power of showing up. After each walk, they would gather on the same patch of grass beneath the same tree. Someone would bring fruit, someone else would bring tea, and their stories were exchanged. Clara began leading small mindfulness moments before each walk. She would ask everyone to take one breath, place a hand on their heart, and remind themselves why they came. It was a simple practice, but week by week, it deepened the bond among them all. One evening, after the group had left and the park grew quiet, Paulo and Clara sat on their usual bench. The sky was streaked with orange and gold. The world felt still. "You've built something beautiful," Clara said gently. Paulo looked at her, eyes warm with gratitude. "We built it together." She reached over, took his hand, and held it. Not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet recognition that something tender had grown between them too. Neither of them needed to name it. It was there in the way they moved in sync during the walks, in the way they shared meals, books, laughter, in the way silence between them never felt empty. Paulo had thought love belonged to youth, to candlelit dinners and roses in vases. But this was different. It was steadier, like a warm fire that didn't flare but never went out. And for a man who once believed his heart had closed its doors, it was the sweetest surprise. They started taking short trips together. Nothing far, just nearby towns, a hiking trail, a garden Clara had always wanted to visit. They laughed over spilled coffee, got lost on country roads, watched sunsets in silence. Every shared moment became a thread weaving a new story. And all the while, their walking group continued to grow. They added new elements, nutrition talks, shared recipes, book circles. People began showing up not just for their health, but for each other. Someone brought their daughter. Another brought a neighbor who had lost his wife. One man said, "I thought I came here to get stronger, but what I really found was family." Paulo listened quietly, and in his heart he knew. He had not just rebuilt his own life, he had become a seed for something larger. A movement of renewal rooted in simplicity, kindness, and the courage to begin again. And through it all, Clara remained by his side, not in front, not behind. Right beside her master, Jan said doggedly, step by step, breath by breath, learning, growing, becoming, together. It had been years since Paulo last stepped into a doctor's office voluntarily. For the longest time, he had avoided medical checkups, not out of denial, but out of fear. He feared hearing something he couldn't change, feared being told that time had taken more than he was ready to give. But this time felt different. It was Clara who gently nudged him, not with worry, but with wisdom. Prevention is an act of love, she had said, not just for yourself, but for the ones who care about you. And so, on a bright morning in early spring, Paulo found himself in the waiting room. The air smelled like antiseptic and hand soap, but he didn't feel anxious. He felt curious about what his body might tell him now that he had started treating it with more kindness. The doctor, a calm, silver-haired man with a warm voice, welcomed him like an old friend. Well, I went through the usual routines: blood pressure, cholesterol, mobility, reflexes. Then, a pause. The doctor looked at the numbers on his chart, raised an eyebrow, and said something Paulo hadn't heard in a long time. Means are excellent. Paulo blinked. Excellent? The doctor nodded, adjusting his glasses. Your blood pressure has stabilized. Your blood sugar is in a healthy range. You've lost some weight, but more importantly, your mobility and energy levels are right where they should be. He paused, then added with a smile, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. It wasn't a miracle. It was confirmation that small steps, repeated over time, create real results. That the effort to show up for himself each day had not only changed how he felt, but changed how he was. When Paulo stepped back out into the sunlight, he stood a little taller. Not because he had been praised, but because he felt connected to his body in a way he hadn't for years. He was no longer at the mercy of age. He was working with it, listening, and collaborating. Later that night, he shared the news with Clara. They sat at their usual spot on the porch, sipping warm herbal tea under a quiet sky. She smiled, her eyes glowing with gentle pride. "I never doubted it," she said. Paulo looked at her, and something soft stirred in his chest. For so long he had associated aging with decline, but now he saw something else. Aging was not a falling, it was a deepening of awareness, of rhythm, of appreciation. Every day had become a conscious act. How he moved, how he breathed, and most importantly, how he showed up for others and for himself. That night, as he lay in bed, Paulo placed a hand over his chest, felt the steady rise and fall, felt the strength that had once seemed lost. He didn't know how many years remained, but he knew this. Each one would be lived with presence, with choice, with love, and that, he thought with a quiet smile, was enough. Clara had always talked about the coastal trail, a winding path that hugged the ocean, dotted with wildflowers and kissed by wind, a place she used to visit when life felt heavy, to remind herself that even waves, no matter how relentless, always return to calm. One afternoon, as they sat sipping tea under their usual oak tree, she mentioned it again. "I'd love to go back there one day," she said, her eyes far away. Paulo didn't hesitate. "Then let's go." She blinked, caught off guard by his certainty. "Are you serious?" He smiled. "I've never been more serious." They packed light, a change of clothes, some fruit and water, 2 walking sticks, and a book Clara loved. It wasn't a long trip, just 2 days, 1 night, but it felt like a threshold. Not just a break from routine, a ritual of arrival, fell into a new way of being. The morning they arrived, the sky was soft and overcast, the air carrying the scent of salt and sage. Paulo took a deep breath, feeling his lungs expand with something more than oxygen. They walked slowly at first, letting their bodies adjust to the shifting ground. The gravel crunched beneath their feet, waves whispered beside them, and seabirds soared overhead like blessings in motion. Neither of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Everything around them did the speaking. "Look how far you've come. Look what's still ahead." At one point, they reached a curve in the trail that opened to a cliff's edge. The ocean stretched wide before them, infinite and quiet, a blue canvas full of movement and stillness all at once. Clara took his hand, and for a long while they stood there in silence. Paulo had always believed this kind of moment belonged to other people, to younger people, to braver people, but now he realized something different. Moments like these didn't belong to anyone. They waited for anyone who dared to meet them. Later that night, as they sat on a small bench near their guest house, wrapped in scarves and listening to the hush of the sea, Clara turned to him and said softly, "You've changed, Paulo." He looked at her, not defensively but with wonder. "Never?" She nodded. "You're more open now, not just with others, with yourself." Paulo didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for her hand, held up with both of his, and whispered, "I think I finally believe I'm allowed to live again." Tears welled gently in her eyes, not from sadness but from recognition, because she, too, had once forgotten. And now here they were, 2 people who had nearly closed the chapter, writing a new one, together. They stayed up late that night, reading under soft yellow light, their laughter drifting like music through the thin coastal air. In that quiet room, filled with the sound of turning pages and shared breath, Paulo felt something settle inside him. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was present. He had stopped running from time and started walking with it. At sunrise, they returned to the trail one last time. As the first rays of gold touched the ocean's surface, Paulo turned to Clara and whispered, "Thank you for seeing the part of me I had forgotten." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her voice no louder than the wind. "You brought him back." They stood like that until the light rose fully and the sky opened wide above them. It wasn't the end of anything. It was the middle. And that, they both knew, was a beautiful place to be. Returning from the coastal trail, something in Paulo had shifted for good. It wasn't just his breath that felt deeper. It was his sense of place in the world. He had once believed that his impact had ended when he retired, when his children moved away, when his hair turned gray. But now he saw it differently. His presence had become a quiet permission slip for others. Permission to start again, to hope, to take care of themselves without shame, to choose vitality over resignation. One afternoon, as Paulo sat under the old oak tree near the park, the very place his walks with Clara had begun, a young man approached him, maybe in his late 20s, shy, with slouched shoulders and eyes heavy from long nights. He sat down slowly, fumbling with the strap of his worn backpack. "I don't mean to bother you," he said, "but my aunt walks with your group. She said you used to feel Paulo nodded, saying nothing. The young man continued, "I think I feel that way now. I don't even know what I'm doing anymore." There was a long pause. Then Paulo placed a hand gently on the bench between them. "You don't need to know yet," he said softly. "You just need to choose one thing to do today that makes tomorrow easier." The young man looked at him, unsure, but listening. And in that moment, Paulo realized something important. He no longer needed to be anyone's hero. He only needed to be a mirror, reflecting back to others what they had forgotten they already carried. Over the following weeks, more people reached out. Some came to walk. Some came just to sit under the tree and breathe. Some came with tears, others with questions. Paulo never claimed to have answers, but he had something else. Presence. He started writing again. Not for a book this time, but for himself. Each morning, before breakfast, he filled a small notebook with short reflections. What he had learned, what he had feared and faced, what he wished someone had told him sooner. Clara read a few pages one afternoon and looked up at him with the same glowing pride she always carried. "You know," she said, "this could help people." He shook his head, modestly. "I'm not a teacher." "No," she said gently. "You're a That word stayed with him. Not a spotlight, not a lecture, just a flame, passed from hand to hand, shared quietly in the dark. He began sharing his writings with the walking group, just a few paragraphs each week. Soon, someone suggested compiling them into a small guidebook. Nothing fancy, just Paulo's voice, printed with care. They called it One Step at a Time. The title came from something he had said often without thinking. Now it felt like a truth carved from experience. The book made its way through the community. A retired school teacher quoted it during a local talk. A young nurse passed it along to a patient who had lost hope. A mother read it to her teenage son, hoping the simplicity would reach where her advice had not. Paulo was humbled by the ripple, but more than that, he was at peace. Because this quiet offering felt like legacy. Not a statue or a monument, but a living thing, breathing in the lives of others, changing small things gently, slowly, deeply. One afternoon, his granddaughter came to visit. He was writing a school essay and wanted to interview him. When he asked her what the topic was, she looked up from her notebook and said simply, "Someone who inspires me." His eyes watered, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because sometimes the reward for a life lived with heart is to see that heart echoed in the eyes of someone younger, someone watching, someone learning, and maybe, just maybe, someone quietly preparing to carry the flame forward. The years passed gently, like autumn leaves drifting across the ground. Paulo no longer needed to measure time by hours or appointments. His days were slow and simple. He would wake with the sun, stretch beside his window, sip his tea slowly, and let the world unfold at its own pace. The community he and Clara had nurtured had grown far beyond what they ever imagined. The Sunday walks had become daily gatherings. A small newsletter now shared Paulo's reflections, paired with recipes, breathing tips, and handwritten notes from new members. There was no leadership, only shared stewardship. Everyone brought something. A smile, a poem, sometimes just presence. Clara remained his quiet companion. They had long stopped counting the years. Their love had no need for timelines or titles. They simply belonged to each other in the way that people do when their souls have walked through change, side by side. Every now and then, Paulo would sit beneath the oak tree, the same one where everything began, and watch new faces join the group. He saw younger people now, some in their 30s, some teenagers brought by their grandparents. He once joked to Clara, "We started a walking group for tired old bones, and now look, we've got musicians and mothers and marathon runners." She laughed, then whispered, "Because everyone is tired of something." Paulo nodded, and for a moment, he felt something ancient inside him settle. He had spent so much of his life trying to be useful, trying to fix, trying to prove, and now he understood. His greatest contribution had never been his wisdom or effort. It was his example that it was never too late, that even the most stuck life could be rekindled, and that joy, no matter how small, was always worth seeking. His health, while steady, had begun to slow. The walks became shorter, the stretches gentler. Some days he stayed home and simply listened to the wind through the leaves. One evening, Clara found him sitting in silence by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the room. She touched his shoulder, gently. "You look far away tonight." He smiled. "I was just thinking, I have nothing left to chase." She sat beside him, her hand resting softly in his. "That's because you've arrived." He turned to her, eyes glistening. "You think so?" "I know so." He nodded. And that night, for the first time in many years, Paulo dreamt not of the past, but of a tree. A tall one, its roots deep in the earth, its branches full of fruit. And beneath it, people gathered not to be taught, but to remember what they already knew. When Paulo passed quietly in his sleep months later, there was no grand announcement, no long obituary, only whispers of gratitude. And a gathering beneath the old oak tree. No one wore black. They wore colors he loved, soft blues, sunflower yellow, olive green. They didn't mourn what was lost. They celebrated what had been given. Stories were shared. Laughter drifted through the park like wind. And Clara, standing with her hand resting gently on the bench they used to share, read aloud one of Paulo's last reflections. "Legacy isn't what you build. It's how you live. It's not what you leave behind. It's what you pass forward." Beneath the tree, a plaque was placed. It bore no dates, just Paula's name, and a line that read, "Menon chose to begin again and showed the rest of us we could too." Today, that park still welcomes new walkers, still holds space for conversations, transformations, and beginnings. And in the rustling of the leaves, the rhythm of footsteps, the echo of shared laughter, Paulo's spirit continues, not as memory, but as momentum. because a single life lived with care can awaken 1,000 more.